Hi, everyone. I am excited to be here today for a discussion of Black History Month. And Black History Month, as everybody knows, it's an effort in education in particular to take off our blinders and to do at least two things. One is to think about the proper representation of the African American story in our programming and our curricula, and to make sure that this story isn't underrepresented or undertold or neglected, and that is a real risk. The second is to give African American children access to their stories, their origin stories in this country. And we can get more into what is the aim of Black History Month and kind of what is the proper aim of it. But that's what Black History Month is. These issues, the issues kind of presupposed by Black History Month of the purpose and the value of a history education, how students relate to different aspects of history, how students form their own identities, how they think about issues of prejudice and discrimination in history, how history is relevant to that, how they think about the role of African American history and history in general. These issues are so important to us that we actually don't want to just leave these ideas to convention or implication. We want to understand these issues from first principles, and where we're coming from, this group is a panel, an advisory group convened by Higher Ground Education. I'm actually at a school right now, which is why I'm wearing a mask. You might hear some preschool students in the background. One of our schools, and 4 of the 5 of the panelists are our parents across our school network. Higher Ground Education is a Montessori organization that covers, we have programming across the country from infancy through high school. We have teacher training at all levels. We're very, very committed to Montessori pedagogy, and how we understand Montessori pedagogy and the aim of education is to promote student independence, student agency in a very deep sense, in the sense of we want to empower students to be the authors of their own lives. And that's the principle from which we want to come at and ask questions about Black History Month. There's clearly something to the idea that the telling of African American history needs to be reconsidered and recalibrated. But we also want to push ourselves to understand this issue. So there are questions and concerns afoot about how the topic of race has become both narrowed and escalated. I think that there are concerns in the culture, in the education establishment, among parents, among educators, about propaganda or activism at the expense of understanding. There are concerns about presuming an identity, especially a racial identity, as something that's default or overriding or morally very important for children. And then there are concerns, I think, simpler concerns, but still very important concerns about having a month for something important, about kind of narrowing Black history into a month, potentially treating it like a checkbox, or having a shallow approach to it because it's kind of siloed, rather than an integrated approach that will help students really understand that history. And there are other issues as well. So let me just introduce everybody quickly, and then we can get to it. Move spotlight. So I am Matt Bateman. I'm the VP of Pedagogy at Higher Ground Education, and we're here with our panel, our advisory panel on these issues of inclusion and diversity. And the goal of this panel, we meet pretty periodically, pretty regularly, it's to understand these issues of identity, inclusion, and race in education. So Ray Girn is the founder and CEO of Higher Ground Education. He has how old is Oscar now?
He's about 8 months.
So he has an 8-month-old and a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old, all enrolled in guidepost schools. Greg Salmieri is, he's a senior scholar of philosophy at the Salem Center for Policy at the University of Texas at Austin. And he has a 1-year-old, is that right? 1-year-old boy?
14 months now, yeah.
14 months. Chloé Valdary is the founder of the Theory of Enchantment, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, at some point during this panel. And Kmele Foster is a partner at Freethink Media. And how old is your daughter?
She's 3.
She's 3, and she just started at a guidepost school in the Bay Area. Is that right?
Yep.
So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here.
For having us.
Thank you.
So why don't we just go around the room and do a round robin on how do you think about Black History Month? What's the purpose of it? How should we think about it as educators? What is at stake in thinking about Black History Month? Ray, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, my interest is really in understanding and relating Black History Month to the broader pedagogy of history, and looking at it from the perspective of the pedagogy of history. And I'd say I'm coming in with, an orientation towards history as fundamentally intellectual history. It's at root a study of the effect of ideas that people have held and the way that that's shaped their proactive and reactive responses to particular circumstances, over the course of the time that human beings have been on the planet. And then more narrowly, I'd say that, I generally have a view that chronology is critical and central to history, that it's a narrative, or more accurately, it's a set of narratives, right, about the past. And that's tempered by a view that, it is valuable to visit and revisit kind of historical topics through different lenses, the history of medicine, the history of science, the history of art, the history of, very particular things like salt or jewelry, like that, you get perspective from doing that. A few other things that I would say are as an orientation, true of kind of me and higher ground, is that the purpose of history education, as I think you said, Matt, is understanding. It's to gain knowledge and to gain perspective, which in turn serves life, in turn serves action. But it's not directly aimed towards, patriotism or activism, or even things like creating a democratic citizenry, or religious conviction, or any other kind of, practical end. Now, it's complicated because, history education does indirectly have tremendous impact on people's beliefs and their kind of adult view of the world. And it, I would argue that creates this kind of temptation to try, more or less to engineer certain outcomes and certain beliefs. And in my view, that's a mistake, right? That if you become prescriptive in that way, you cross a kind of fine line, right? And so if you believe, I may believe that if I teach, history, and if we approach kind of the pedagogy of history in the right way, children will see themselves as global citizens, right, and regard others with goodwill. But if I make that my goal, rather than simply kind of my judgment that is the effect of a proper history education and an emergent outcome, I think it's a recipe for going off the rails in certain ways. That you start focusing on, making sure the students are saying the right thing and arriving at the right answer, rather than engaging in a certain type of process. And so there's a real sensitivity that I'm bringing to this conversation about not trying to create believers, right, of the one true faith, but to try to create thinkers who have the tools to kind of navigate, all of the questions and issues of life. And then I'd say finally, like, I'm a humanist in orientation, or universalist, in that I think what's fundamentally correct is a perspective on ourselves and on each other, that we're members of the same species, discovering kind of varied paths to the same truths, and that the timely, in a sense, considerations are always best informed by the timeless ones. And again, I'm bringing that lens to this conversation. So, that's the general frame. I have more to say, but hopefully that helps as a starting point.
Yeah, definitely. Super, super interesting. I mean, there's a lot there to dig into, just in terms of what is the direct aim of history, what might less direct aims be, and how should educators think about that issue. I'm just going to go clockwise as you guys appear on my screen. So, Kmele.
Well, I'm delighted to be included in the conversation. Just as a little bit of background, this Black History Month is something born out of a thing called Black History Week, which dates back to the early 1910s, if I'm not mistaken, maybe mid 1910s. Carter G. Woodson birthed this thing, and among others. And the gist of it, the goal was to amplify this forgotten history or this little known history, to give a people in the United States who perhaps were thought to at least didn't have a sense of who they were in this particular country, to give them a sense of their own history so that they could have a better opportunity to kind of shape their own future. And I think it's important to keep that aspiration in mind, but also important to keep our own aspirations in mind for the kind of society we want to be. And in the context of, I think, an educational academy, an educational institution, the kind of lessons that we're hoping to impart to our students. I think that there are both opportunities and challenges with respect to something like Black History Month, certainly an opportunity to talk about things that might have been overlooked. But I think what often goes underappreciated is some of the challenges associated with it. And it's certainly the case that when you take something and you kind of put a historical lens, you look at history through the lens of race, there are all sorts of things that we end up doing as a result of that, that we may or may not be aware of. And I often get a bit concerned about the possibility that we kind of balkanize history or create a perception that certain kinds of history only belong to some Americans. I believe it was James Baldwin who suggested that the history of the African Americans, like this is American history, is not something separate from, it is fundamentally a part of. And I do think that it belongs to every single American in a very fundamental sense, and that the lessons that are there can be drawn upon by every American, and that for the students themselves, the thinking from my own standpoint, and really with respect to just kind of an understanding of history broadly, my hope is that they don't view this particular history as sort of the history of someone else in particular, or themselves in particular, or the sort of only way to try and imbue their own sort of personal experience with meaning, but that they are finding ways to extract unique lessons from particular people, that they don't imagine that, for example, John Brown is not a part of that history, that Elijah Lovejoy is not a part of that history. These are two men who were devout abolitionists who both gave their lives in service of trying to overcome a certain challenge, which is, the history of slavery in this country, which tends to often be kind of the focal point of African American history. And then to sort of shift gears to talk about achievement, I certainly think it's appropriate to highlight underrepresented achievements, but in much the same way, when we sort of elevate an achievement and say, oh yeah, and this was accomplished by a Black person, the two perils there, I think, are to potentially trivialize things, to kind of tokenize them and make them seem as though it's important because it was accomplished by a Black person, or it's more important because it was accomplished by a Black person. But also, I think, to create a sensibility that this, again, is sort of uniquely valuable to one student because they too identify as Black. And I think there are opportunities to have conversations about that. There are opportunities to interrogate the ideas around race and around identity in the context of Black History Month, to interrogate the ways that our understanding of race has evolved and changed, and the ways that our understanding of race in history may in fact be something that we could evolve in different ways to perhaps attain some better goal, if in fact we're moving towards something that's more universalist. And that's our hope and our aspiration, to sort of regard one another as sort of fully human individuals, to give each other the dignity of being viewed and treated as individuals. Then how are we leveraging something like Black History Month in service of that goal?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's a kind of nuanced line to walk where it seems like part of what you're saying, Camille, we can explore this, is like, yeah, there's like a perspective here that's valuable, but there are risks in approaching it that way that make it like you don't want to use kind of Black history as a moniker that others it and makes it harder for some students to relate to and kind of silos it. And it both has to be highlighted and somehow kept integrated and kind of in this universalist, humanist way, similar to what Ray was talking about. Chloe?
Hi, so when I think about this issue, I think about the motto of the United States, which is E pluribus unum, out of many one. And I think that Black History Month has to be, as Kmele was saying, in service of that vision, which is a vision that attempts to balance the particular with the universal and root the universalist understanding of a humanist worldview in particular experiences. I went to an elementary school called Langston Hughes Elementary School for about 4 or 5 years, which was a very, formative experience. And Black History Month was quite redundant in a sense. So Black History Month didn't really stand out to me because African American history in general was a part of the curriculum on some level in a very integrated sort of year-round way. And so I wonder about the experience that other people may have who were exposed to Black History Month and exposed to the history of the African American experience, but only within that particular context of February, and the difference that they may have come away with in having that experience. I feel like on some level, I would like to see the month of February as designated as Black History Month be transformed into a curriculum that integrates it year round. And another experience that comes to mind when I think about this is my 10th grade English experience. We were exposed to, things like the Epic of Gilgamesh and Shakespeare and, all of these various, Homer's The Odyssey. And the entire time, no one was, in terms of deriving value and deriving meaning from these texts, no one thought to themselves, oh, well, I am not an ancient Greek person, so there's no way I can relate to this. Or, I did not come from ancient Mesopotamia or Babylon, so I have no idea how to see myself, reflected in the stories of the Epic of Gilgamesh. That was never, a concern or a challenge. And so I want to see in that same way an experience of Black History Month where people can relate to it on that same level, where they can say to themselves, oh, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's a line that goes, the strongest of men will fall to fate if he has no judgment, right? So that's a value system that's promoting discernment and wisdom and the importance of pursuing that. And there's no reason why a person wouldn't be able to get that same lesson out of Black History Month or a much longer, I guess, integrated curriculum. So I echo the comments of those who spoke before me in the sense that I do believe it has to be integrated. And we haven't collectively, certainly not as a country, done that. But I would love for higher ground to pursue this project because it's a noble project. It's a project worthy of the American project.
Yeah, and I think, what's interesting in what you say, Chloe, which really resonates with me is there are kind of, there's like a known tool set and vocabulary in education for, like if a student just isn't interested in ancient Greece or Egypt or whatever, like it's not like we just throw up our hands and be like, well, I guess ancient Greece isn't for the student. It's like, how can we inspire a connection? Like there are lessons here. Like if you don't know about the death of Socrates, you're not going to understand the modern world. So like, and it's a personally interesting story, and there are moral lessons there. So how do we connect each and every student to that story? And kind of, I wonder how much mileage we could get out of just bringing that framework to African American history and saying, what are the core lessons? What should everybody learn from African American history? This is history for everybody. It's history for Black kids and white kids and everything in between and everything else. And if you're missing out on it, you're missing out. Like, and that's the kind of primary orientation. The other thing you mentioned, Chloe, which I definitely want to underscore and talk about, is like, who is Black History Month for? Is it for the student and that this is the month that you study Black history? Or is it better thought of as like, this is for educators, curriculum developers. This is a time to kind of be like, let me review the whole year and my next year and think about how I'm approaching issues of African American history in the curriculum, and whether I have biases and blinders, whether I'm getting it short shrift, whether I'm getting the full value out of it. And those are two very different perspectives. I mean, I think in my public school education, it was definitely the former approach. It was like Black History Month, it's time for the students. I don't think it was a time for the educators. Greg.
Yeah, so let me say a bit about my experience of Black History Month as a, white kid going to a suburban school that's supposedly a good school, and what I took from it, and then what I think about it now. And both of them are different ways disappointments. So it felt like there was a plot or a story to history in school the way it was normally taught. I don't think it was done very well, but things happened in some kind of order, and and then suddenly it's February and we're talking about stuff that happened involving Black people, but who knows where in the story. It seemed like, why weren't, like 3 months ago we were talking about the 1700s, there were Black people then, why are they coming up now? So it seemed like all out of order and just kind of imposed into it. And then it just struck me as horribly disrespectful and patronizing. And you were like, there were these token Black people mentioned, that some of whom wouldn't have gotten mentioned other than that we're looking for Black people to name. So someone who invented something that was good but fairly minor, Garrett Morgan, I think is the guy's name, who invented a traffic light, very cool. But like, there are lots of inventions of that scale we don't talk about the inventors of. They just needed some number of Black people, and someone knew about this guy. It just seemed like very tokenizing and disrespectful. And like, well, why isn't this just part of regular history? Whatever of this deserves to be part of regular history. And that's what I thought as a kid. But then in the last, 10 years or so, I got really interested in understanding American history and the history of race relations more, and I started reading up on it. And I started to resent Black History Month a lot more then, because I feel like I was cheated out of this tremendously fascinating history. There is this plot here. These people, in some level I knew this before, but there's a whole population of people by force moved halfway around the world. There's not another movement of people like this on scale in history. There are all kinds of, treated in the most evil and unjust and inhumane ways. There's a whole kind of dynamic about how that plays off with a country that feels guilty about doing it and is evading it. And there are all kinds of different decisions made. How do we emancipate? If we do emancipate, among people who thought slavery was evil, Black and white, there were different views about how to end it. Now that it's ended, should the Black people go back to Africa? Should they stay here? Should they secede and get their own little territory? There were all kinds of disagreements about how to do this. Different things were tried at different times and didn't work and did work. There were, for example, during abolition, there were like attempts at boycotts, right? Like the free produce movement, and some abolitionists got on board with it, but then it didn't work. And the main, all these kind of just fascinating questions of like, how do you deal with this really unique and awful situation in history, some real heroism in different ways people dealt with it. Some, and there's a plot to it of different things happen at different times. There were different disagreements. And the most you learn about this is, I think Du Bois and Booker T. Washington didn't agree with each other, and Martin Luther King was good. And maybe Malcolm X is scary or something. That's the most inspiring that people get about this. And there's just so much to learn. The way the Black business community was involved, and the financing for different movements. People like TRM Howard is a really fascinating figure. The different views going on in the NAACP, it earlier being more dominated by Northern whites than as Du Bois did. There's just so much of a history here of people with different ideas about how to deal with a tremendously difficult and moral pressing problem. And then different things that were done at different times and worked and backfired, and people still don't agree about what worked. Why are we not taught this story? And then the question of, should we devote February to studying it, or should it be kind of put into different parts of the year? That's a kind of, different schools maybe should do that differently depending on their pedagogy. But there's a plot here. There's a story here that's part of understanding our world. And I just feel cheated out of it by my education, particularly when a month every year was set aside to talk about this. And all people take away from it is, oh, it's a black guy who invented the traffic light, which is cool, but it's not the point.
Yeah, that's similar to my experience of Black history. I don't think it was quite that bad at my schools. I mean, my schools were very diverse and integrated from that perspective. And I think that there was just a background kind of similar to Chloe, but not as good. It sounds like Chloe had a better experience with it. There was just a kind of background like, yeah, like this is an integrated part of the story. But it was, lots of things in school feel like this. So this is like an instance of this problem and not particular to Black history, but it just felt gimmicky. It felt like, I didn't have the word tokenizing or the concept tokenizing, but if I did, I would have called it tokenizing. Like it felt like this is like these assemblies that they make us do once a month where they tell us to recycle, or this is like, the day the DARE officer comes in and tells us that if, that marijuana is a gateway drug. Like there's this category of things as a student that if you're discerning, or even if you're not discerning, children are very good kind of BS detectors. You're just like, there's an adult here who like wants to make me good somehow, and there's something suspicious about it. And what was that?
These pieties.
Yeah, these pieties. Yeah, and everything about it was kind of filtered through that perspective. And what was missing, and what I would like to do in approaching it as history is, I mean, there's a common theme through all of your answers, is that, a good slogan might be, put the history back in Black history. Like this is real history. It's an integrated, deep, compelling part of world history, of American history. And precisely for that reason, it shouldn't be siloed. Like there might be a kind of thread that you can follow, and in that sense, there might be a kind of unit for it or a focus on it, but it's not something that should be thought of like the special province of a certain demographic or a certain set of students, or a kind of political problem to solve. It's a historical problem, and there's a lot of value to mine there.
Well, I would ask the question, as a Canadian, so I had to focus on American history in general more as an adult. Is Black history, as we're talking about it, a species of American history? And are we really talking about the right way to teach American history? Or are we talking about, because when you're talking about, racial identity, then it's a kind of, you're talking about someone who's Black, irrespective of whether they're American or whether they're Jamaican or whether they're African. So it might be worth pausing on that point. I'd be interested in hearing different opinions on that.
I mean, there's also this question of how to teach American history, and this is a big issue in history departments, right? To what extent do you silo off history by nations? So you could think of it as, look, there's the history of the Atlantic, or the things that border the Atlantic, and a big part of it is that there was this trade between, Africa for slaves, rum in the West Indies produced by slave labor, and sugar, and the North America, and so if you assume that we're going to teach it by country, then there's like, what's the role, how do we incorporate Black history or the elements of it into American history? But there's the question of, to what extent is history carved up by country? And I think there's an approach where you can say, look, there are people everywhere, and countries are just lines on a map, and who cares about that? And I think that's a mistake, because how countries are governed is a big part of why things happen the way they are, and a part of understanding the role of ideas in history. On the other hand, if you make it seem like the borders on the map are too hard and fast, and you can make it seem as though you could understand America as though there was no whole rest of the world going on, and as though the Haitian Revolution had no impact on America, or what Britain was doing. So I think there's a bigger question I don't know the answer to, about how do you think about national histories in the context of world history, and how integrative, and how do you do it? And I don't know the answer to that, but that's going to be tied to this question.
Yeah, I mean, this is the question of kind of what, sometimes with our history curriculum developers, we talk about the fact that the kind of geographic and temporal scales of history themselves change throughout history. Like globalization, modern globalization and modern instantaneous interaction and communication is not the norm throughout history. Like you go back 1,000 years and like, in what sense was there world history and in what sense was it? Like that topic changes kind of across time. But I'm curious, I just want to pause on this thing that Ray asked about, Black history versus African-American history. Is that a kind of fruitful level of analysis for a plot thread or a unit in history?
I'd say that, it would make more sense to me and I know that this line also has some caveats, but, I grew up experiencing this topic as African-American history specifically, not, I think, the more broader Black history, because obviously there are people who are Black who are not descendants of slaves in the American context in particular. And I also think that there's obviously something a bit tenuous and not fully formed even about the term African American, because obviously you can also be an African immigrant who moves to America, who also is not a part of the story that we're talking about. So it's a bit tricky to figure out like how what are the borders in terms of the terminology. But this is how I grew up with it. African American history was the specific term that was used more than Black history. I also think that there might be something good about that in the sense that it actually focuses less on skin color, and that might lend itself to people being able to see themselves reflected in the history itself. But I'm not sure. Like maybe you split the difference between African American and Black, but that was how I grew up.
Kmele, if you're talking, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Something I find very intriguing about the conversation we're having are just, all of the interesting ways that things are far more complicated than we usually appreciate. And one of the things that I most love about conversations with my daughter is she will oftentimes introduce something that I sort of take for granted, just how amazingly complex and interesting this actually is. And she'll turn it over and look at it in a different way. And I think inviting students to contemplate some of the difficulty of categorizing something as African-American versus Black, and pushing the boundaries and getting people to think about just how much these ideas limit our understanding, or how they may direct our thinking in a particular way. And I think with history broadly, certainly as it was mentioned earlier, the notion of sort of national boundaries being something that are important, information revolutions being something that might be the thing that we want to pay particular attention to. All of these different ways of casting history and what it means for the way that we think about ourselves at a particular moment in time and what we think about our possibilities for the future, I think are great. And inviting kids into that complexity and all of that nuance, I think, is wonderful. There's a very big difference between sort of muddying the waters and kind of indulging in things that are like, oh, you're being a little pedantic here, and really engaging with something that I think is genuinely interesting and ought to sort of stimulate their curiosity and inspire us all to think a little bit differently. And yes, give us opportunities to find new and distinct handholds that make this particular event or these particular people who I might not have otherwise been able to imagine as like me, make that history come alive and give you an opportunity to really extract something new and informative and relevant from it.
But one of the things I think that we have thought a lot about as kind of experts in learning science and pedagogy, and people who are forming a view is, what are the prerequisites intellectually, cognitively, in terms of knowledge, to engage in certain types of thinking, certain types of exploration. And And a common pedagogical mistake is we as adults have a kind of certain advanced topic that we're interested in, like, oh, there's the latest discovery in biochemistry, and it's like, now I got to change my third grade biology curriculum, and something is off about that, right? And so, for example, you start with the base 10 system, and you later go and say that, well, this is a convention. You could have done a base 6 system in terms of how we count numbers. You could have, gone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 11, right? And you didn't have to go to 10, and there's reasons why. And I actually, as a math teacher, was like, you know what, I'm going to explain that at the outset, elementary school. And it was way over, the heads of my students. And it came to realize that, like, a lot of learning is about, you start with a kind of overly simplified understanding and framework, and then you trust that, just as we all transcend these frameworks, our students will transcend these frameworks. And there's a discomfort kind of with that idea that is far beyond this issue. And so Matt has this great example, I think, when he did an observation of students, in terms of organizing, geopolitical organization of continents, and raising, I think it was 4th or 5th graders. Matt, you could probably tell the story of, like, why do we organize it one way as against another? Or I'll give you another example. Like, I'm doing this with with my younger son, right? My middle son right now. Like, why is a whale a fish? Like, why would you categorize, is a whale more like a cow or more like a fish, right? And he's heard that it's like a cow, and so he says that. But as soon as you start asking him, like, really, look at this, you really think this looks more like a cow than a fish? And so the first step is getting him to see, no, it looks more like a fish. And then you can get to, the bone structure, the live birth, and it's a real understanding that we as human beings can categorize things in certain ways. So I would say I love the idea of bringing the meta level question into the classroom, upper elementary, middle school, high school. You want to do it as early as possible. There's a risk of waiting too long. You have to trust the ability of students to think. But I would just, caveat that with the point that there is such a thing as doing it too young. And then students are just looking for the adults around them to kind of signal what the right answer is, because they can't get the issue themselves.
Let me say, to just make it a little more concrete, what some of the questions are about international versus America. Like, if you're going to focus on American history as an item and you're telling that story over time, it seems, which I think is a great thing to do, it seems to me there are at least two ways in which you want to be sure periodically to check in with the rest of the world in that story. And one of them is the problems America's having, the things it's solving, what it's doing, involve the rest of the world. So if we're thinking about slavery, there's a slave trade that involves several different nations, and it's going back and forth. And so that's one thing. And then revolutions happen in other countries that impact what we do here. So that's kind of the check-in, because the story is not self-contained. And then the other reason why we might, and likewise the story of emancipation and stuff isn't self-contained. But the other thing that we might want to do is also think about parallel stories going on in other countries that are relevant for understanding. So, like that in America with people of African descent and people of Native American descent, there was this kind of one-drop thinking, right? Where if you have a white parent and a black parent, you're black in America, but in Brazil or in someplace else, it's thought of differently. And therefore, what's understood as the races or how people group people in, like, Jamaica is very different than how it's grouped here. And someone, who'd be called black here would be called some other thing there. And it's just very different. And so knowing these kinds of things kind of help to raise questions about, well, why do we do it this way? And what would it be like if we did it that way? And knowing, like, America's not the only country that had slavery. It's not even the only country that imported a lot of slaves from Africa. Or imported some that, enslaved a lot of people in Africa and took them here. So how did it play out differently here versus there? And I think those check-ins in other countries from time to time are kind of useful as a understanding of, like, what things were caused by slavery and what things weren't caused by slavery. What things were caused by, why is America so rich? Is it because of this? Well, then why isn't Brazil as rich? And so forth. And these kinds of questions, are good historical thinking.
Let me make it even more concrete. So I think if you think about what we're trying to accomplish in education, which is roughly we want our students to competently think their way through life and to be able to act intelligently in the face of every issue, whether it's things that they need to know to vote, or prejudice that they're facing in their personal life, or like dating or work problems, or just understanding the world around them. Like, how can we make them independently competent? A question that everyone is confronted with, there are questions that everybody is confronted with that have to do with race, if you're living in, especially if you're living in America, but I think probably if you're living anywhere, including like really big questions like, is race even real? Like, what is it? Is it a social construction? Is it a lie? Is it something historical? I mean, these kind of big metaphysical, biological seeming questions, or like, how important of a problem is racism? Like, is it at the bottom of all injustice in the world, or is there something else that explains it? How does it relate to other kinds of injustices? And I don't think that we as a culture are very good at thinking about these questions. I mean, like, these are the kinds of questions that either they're just not asked kind of explicitly, they're like not part of the conversation, or they're like if you go to like a good liberal arts college or something, they might be covered, but they're covered in a way where it's like, okay, like, this kind of gets at what Ray was saying, and I think what Greg is saying, like, how do you set a student up such that once these questions are coming up explicitly, you're able to think about them? And one thing you might want is a pretty detailed knowledge of history and kind of different examples from history and stories from history that might inform this idea of like, is race a lie? Is it historical? Is it cultural? What is it? If you've got a lot of different data from history and narratives from history, that might help you assess that question and position yourself with respect to it. And that's definitely how I think of, I don't know what to call it because of Chloé, Black history, African American history, the history of the African slave trade in this country. But I think about that, you know, what is the sequence there? Like, how can we make more competent thinkers over time?
I will just add one thing about like my experience in elementary school. It was very clear that the integration of African American history was for a very specific purpose, like an ethical, moral purpose. And the ethical, moral purpose was to understand the difference between what it means to be a slave and what it means to be free. Not merely, but also including in the material sense, but in the sort of spiritual, psychological sense. So that was the grand aim of the entire educational process. And, you know, I don't know how or if that complicates what we're saying, but I do think it's a different way of thinking of a purpose, I mean, not merely for the purpose of getting people to understand history, but to be able to situate themselves within it from an ethical perspective. That is not to say that the goal is to have, you know, students emerge with a very specific set of talking points. Like, that's not the point. But there is a moral center that is trying to, like, this idea of the development of a moral center in students was a part of that objective, giving people an education in the first place.
Yeah, sounds like a good school. And I'm curious whether I was thinking about this in response to what Matt and Greg were saying, but what you were saying, Chloé touches on as well. You know, what is the role of slavery in this whole discussion? Because I feel like there's a sense in which we're assuming that is the kind of key, you know, fact around which this all emerges, and maybe that's the case. Maybe all the you know, and there's a sense in which it's the story of kind of emerging head high out of a beginning of slavery, or maybe that's you know, maybe part of the reason that we're talking about the guy who invented a traffic light is because we're trying to get away from that perspective. So I'm curious to hear thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting, you know, just to refer back to the origins of the tradition, which began as a week, became a month, but the notion of giving a people a sense of who they are and where they came from so that they can have a better sense of where they're going. And that's fine for the time at which it was established. But I think it's always worth thinking about our traditions, reassessing them, reassessing the goals of those traditions, and asking ourselves if this is compatible with our needs today. And I think our needs are different. I'd hope they are, because we're some ways removed from that. And if they are different, then what are they? And the phrase that has continued to come to mind as we've been having this conversation is this notion of a more perfect union, being US centric here. And the notion that there is a particular story, perhaps like the African American story, that perfectly illustrates, or perhaps ideally illustrates, that trajectory from sort of the beginnings of a country with all of its many imperfections to one that is sort of continually very difficult and arduous struggles, improving upon itself and trying to become something better. And I think that, for me, certainly when I think about like African American history or Black History Month, like that's the way in which I think about it. And that's the way in which I imagine this as something that genuinely belongs to everyone who imagines themselves as a part of that tradition or is curious about that tradition, and what its values are. And I think to address that specific question about slavery, I think there are plenty of great thinkers that one could consult, but I think Barbara Field's work is probably pretty indispensable here. Like, she has some papers that would be great for educators to familiarize themselves about the difficulty of navigating race as an ideology. And her perspective is, I think, pretty distinct. At this point, I wouldn't say it's unique in the sense that other people have borrowed from it, but the notion that sort of race is something that doesn't begin the conversation, but racism gives rise to race, which is a really, for me at least, when I encountered that idea, it was pretty revelatory, because it challenges a lot of the things that we bring to the table when we think about ourselves and we think about others, and we're thinking about how race interacts with us in society. So I think her work would be really indispensable to anyone who's trying to think about how to imagine invigorating this subject in a new and distinct way, or how to explore some of the challenges and contours around conversations about race and slavery and how it pertains to the history of the country and our relationship with the ideology of race.
Yeah, so there's the relationship between slavery and American history, and then there's the relationship between African American history and slavery. And if I think of like Chloé, like in podcasts and on Twitter, like talking about, say, music and the kind of impact on music. Do you ground that in the same narrative about kind of emerging out of slavery, or is that is that kind of a mistake to see that as an expression of kind of a one story unfolding?
Well, I think it's more about like the individuation process. Again, going back to this moral question at the center of how do you go from being a slave to being free? And the artistic tradition is a part and parcel of an approach to answering that question. Like, the artistic process is a process of going forth into chaos and bringing back meaning and order. And so it is a kind of a metaphorical expression, and represented in the poetic and musical creations of going into the chaos, or being kidnapped and thrust into the chaos of slavery, and then coming out of that painstakingly through the lens of taking what you are surrounded by and turning it into meaning and turning it into order. And it's a resiliency arc. And so in that sense, the poetic and musical and artistic tradition is the point almost of telling this story.
Yeah, it seems like, especially Chloé, from just interacting with you and your work, which maybe we should talk a little bit more about, one of the themes to draw out, like if you kind of ask the question, what do we want students to connect with in history? Like, what is the story there for all students? It has something to do with resilience and transcendence and, self-liberation and liberation, and just the kind of the interaction between moral wrongs and ideals fallen short. And I don't know if anybody can put it more eloquently than that, but like, is that the kind of lines along which we should be thinking about, you know, what is the purpose of this kind of strand in history, or what's the aspect of history that we're focusing on here? Yes,
because again, as I stated earlier, this is also what I got out of, you know, the study of Homer and the study of all of these other ancient traditions was a moral value system and a way of making sense of oneself in the world. And it also gives a person a grounded sense of being, which is super, super important, especially in a society, I think, where increasingly some of the unhealthy approaches to Black History Month or to combating racism stem, I personally believe, from an unhealthy sense of being. That's an unhealthy sense of self. And actually, giving people access to the African American experience in a curriculum can actually help them develop that sense of self. In the same way that, exposing people to Shakespeare and exposing people to The Great Gatsby and the Epic of Gilgamesh, etc., can do the same thing.
Ray, in a way you're asking the question, if I'm understanding it, why are we thinking of slavery as the central fact in this story, if we are, or should we be? And so part of it I think is, what are you doing if you're thinking about Black or African American history or Black American history as a thing? Like, what is it you're trying to understand? And the way that I think of it is, we have a country here that has people in it, whose ancestors came from different places at different times. And typically, if you have people whose ancestors got here 200 or 300 years ago, they're all mixed together, and you can't if you find someone whose ancestors came to the country 200 years ago who's white, some of them were from Germany, some were from France, some might have been from Southern Italy, some might have been from, they'll mostly have been from England, but you won't know and you won't care, and there'll be nothing about it marking you as different. But some people's ancestry is from Africa and some from Europe, and that difference is very marked. Like, people look different enough that you can kind of guesstimate which one, at least in a lot of cases, and they're in different parts of the city. And there are different artistic and musical traditions which cross-pollinate and influence one another for the good, but still you could say, oh, that was a Black, Renaissance, or that was Black music. Whether or not you should do that, there's this kind of cultural apartness or difference. And the question is why is that, and how should we understand that, and what should we think about that going forward, and how much of that is, what are the causes of that? And that some people were brought here in chains, and then after that system ended, still discriminated against, and then by the majority of the society, and then that they were reacting to that, right, in various ways, is I think just essential to understanding why this should be. Why is there a Black part of this city and a white part of this city, or some cities are, where you don't have that with my ancestors came from Italy, but there's not the part of New York where more of the people came from Naples than Rome, and they don't, and you can tell when you go from one part and the music there is a little different. That doesn't happen, right? So what is perpetuating this? Why is it? And I think it's the history of slavery and racism and Jim Crow that's creating that. And that is also the way in which racism creates race, right? Because if people didn't care about this, they'd all sleep with one another and live next to one another and whatever, and you wouldn't be able to tell, 100 years later whose ancestors are from where. As in some cases of people you can't, right? Including some people, African and European ancestry.
Yeah, and to some extent, that is my experience growing up in Toronto, Canada, where everyone's kind of, you don't see the Balkanization that you see in the United States, and everyone's kind of living together. And it's interesting. Okay, you're getting origin stories, and there is Little Italy, and there is Chinatown, and so there's a sense in which it's interesting to explore because it's a form of knowing yourself, and knowing those you interact with, and there's a value and a pleasure in that. So I get it at that level, right? That knowing, and then I think the point that you're making, Greg, is that this is kind of, it's what makes it distinctive And that's part of what I was asking. Like, is there a sense in which when you look at, just using music and kind of musical influence on culture, or that that part of the process of discovery is seeing the interesting ways in which there's a connection between that and the kind of liberation story.
And it's striking that so much of American music is influenced by the African American tradition, and including all of the sorts that are thought to be distinctive to America, jazz, rock and roll.
Mm-hmm.
And the question of the role of that in racial integration in history is also really interesting, I think.
Yeah, you could have a whole element of history that focused on that, the history of African American music.
Yeah, let me restate my point. Yeah, and to restate the point, like if you look at that point, Matt, of like the role of music, like are we gonna kind of, is the goal here to stop making it about slavery, this exploration, or is the goal not to do that in a sense of like that is the fundamental truth to which to relate all these other interesting things, right? I mean, I think that and why, I think that's
isn't this a kind of general moral, so any kind of, and you could do this at the individual level too, for like being a cancer survivor or trauma or something like that. I mean, there's a you could ask it of Jewish history and the Holocaust. Like there's
Sure.
other examples where if what you're doing with the trauma or the moral wrong is reducing everything to that, or kind of externalizing everything about this person and their character and the culture to that, rather than seeing, I think that the right way to see it is, there is an input to this person or this people's character and decision making and values, a huge input and a really morally shocking input. And then there's how did they take it and respond to it, and how did everybody else around them take it and respond to it, and how did those things interact? And everything in history is like that, though. Everything in history is an input. Like, I don't think you should see history as like the plague happened and therefore these people are like that, and the Holocaust happened and therefore these people are like that. It's like, what did they think? How did they evaluate it? Like, and that is the morally interesting question. That's the human condition.
Yeah,
everybody has that.
So there's the question of what are the signal historical episodes or events that set up big questions and big circumstances and big happenings, and that you can never forget about that, or you'll totally lose your plot in the story. Mm-hmm. But then there's what's the story that happens from there. So the fact of slavery and the slave trade is how the stage got set for everything that would then happen later. But and so you can't lose that, or you don't know what drama you're in. But then to say, like, Louis Armstrong's life is about slavery. No, it's about what Louis Armstrong did. I mean, now, if you want to know why there were certain neighborhoods and where he was and why he, you're going to have to then go back into the history. But if you're going from him forward, it's about what he thought and did and came up with, and then how people react to that and what he did with it. And likewise for any other figure, whatever, ancestry they may have.
Yeah, I mean, one thought that I'm having again, though, interestingly, as we're talking about like music and African-American contributions to music and the degree to which the unique art forms, certainly the distinctly American ones, seem to emerge out of like African-American traditions, is like, we do know that, with jazz, there were plenty of people who were important to and influential in the jazz scene who were not Black. And the interesting sort of complexity there is to grapple with like why there were perhaps so many Black people who were involved in that space, or why it takes a community of people who are less than mainstream or something other than mainstream to give rise to a really unconventional and ultimately influential art form. Like, those are the interesting dynamic conversations that you can have. And again, it's always the opportunity and the challenge of having a conversation and having this framing with respect to race, well, yeah, race, I suppose, or ethnicity, depending on how one wants to think about this, that you can unintentionally, inadvertently obscure some of the contributions from distinct people and make this seem a bit too particular, and not really appreciate the actual dynamics that are at play there. I think that the fact that race, once it becomes the metric or the lens through which we're viewing things, can often seem like an explanation for things, when in fact there are more complicated dynamics that are playing out behind the scenes that have to be explored, and have to be interrogated or investigated in order for us to get a real deep understanding of what's actually taking place.
Yeah, I would say even more strongly that it is ideas, and ideas are informed by experiences, and it's an interplay between kind of a people holding certain ideas. But I'm very interested in Sikh history because I grew up Sikh, and looking at the kind of, a very small minority in India and the ways that it had influence and the relationship with the British. I'm interested in I read a book on Mongolia recently, and and I think it's similar. And you recommended Thomas Sowell's Ethnic America, which I'm kind of halfway through. It's fascinating, that the level of differences between Irish Americans and Italian Americans, and then how those overplay, kind of play themselves out. And
yeah, the differences and similarities as well.
The differences
and routine
and
patterns. Yeah,
exactly. And so this is what I had said in the beginning, that in the end, I come back to kind of, it's still an examination of the ideas and the orientations that interplayed with circumstances, and that people held, and how that shaped them. And it's and I would like to believe that it's a form of getting to know myself, like that, in the sense that you do, part of the joy of it is, like, I do feel like it deepens my knowledge kind of as a human being of myself and of human beings, and that we can impart that interest and that perspective to all children.
One thing that's,
Yeah, go ahead.
okay.
I was just going to say, I think part of the understanding of that interplay, and maybe this is a curricular consideration, would go back to actually understanding West Africa, right? And the emphasis placed on music as a way of life and as a mode of being in West Africa, which I think, against the backdrop, it makes sense why so much of the contribution or of the creativity that came out of this experience was so artistic in nature. It was because it was sort of, coming from a culture pre-slavery that very much valued the arts in general, and music in particular, as a way of communicating with one another over, tribal differences and within tribes and things of that nature.
Yeah, and that's very interesting in relation to, like, you're saying that preceded slavery versus, in some sense, focusing on how slavery might have amplified or, awakened. Yeah. Go ahead, Greg.
One of the things you mentioned, Ethnic America, which several of us were talking about last time, and one of the things that book really drove home to me, and I think is an important part of the education you need to start thinking about these African American history issues, is that there are other kinds of stories to integrate with this, about different groups of people who came in different situations, some more or less unjustly treated, to different areas, and within America and within other countries, and how that played out. And you need, I think, to think about that, to think about what's distinctive and not distinctive about the African American story. And one thing that Sowell is very good at pointing out is that there are multiple migrations to think about in Black history. So there's not just the initial slave trade, but then there's the Great Migration to the North. And how do we think about, in what ways is the move of Black people from a rural environment in the South, where they're very poor and mistreated, to urban cities in the North, where then a big influx of them comes in at once? How is that alike and unalike the other cases where large rural populations from other countries migrated into mostly Northern American cities at different times, sometimes a little bit before, sometimes a little bit after? How do we think about that migration? And this is where the Black and Irish and Italian comparisons are very interesting, because there are, whichever pair of those you take, interesting similarities and differences.
A little bit cautious about time here, but let me just kind of pivot a little bit, and this might get at a couple other issues more directly that we haven't discussed. I'm curious to go around, especially, Chloe, you can answer this too if you want, but for those of you that have children, I mean, everybody here, I don't think that there's a child above the age of 6, but how do you, I mean, you know, we run early childhood programs, Montessori's early childhood. I think that it's relevant to start thinking about these issues early. Like, how do you think about it with your kids? Like, what do you want for your kids in terms of an educational experience that sensitizes them to certain issues of race or history or not? I mean, what are the concerns there, or the values there that you have?
Who wants to start? I mean, I'll just say very briefly, like, I mean, I'm just on that kind of traditional axis of seeing and appreciating people as individuals and individuals with agency. And also just inculcating a curiosity about the world, right? And if my son wanted to learn about a certain religion, I'd be like, go to a mosque or a synagogue or a church and just like go. So that to be just on this quest to know, and so that combination of like being interested in knowledge and respecting individual agency. I mean, that's core to our program, that these kind of these pillars. And so, you know, I try to model that, and there's a sense in which, you know, I'm seeing what emerges in terms of in my kids' interest and trying to be responsive to that at this age, instead of being too proactive. Obviously, they're going through our curriculum, so I do know that they're going to get kind of exposure to a lot of content that I think is important.
Yeah. I mean, I'm very committed to nurturing Leah's curiosity. She has this, she has a passion for rocks, and we will be just walking someplace and she will find these rocks, which to me look the same, like they're all the same. And for her, you know, every single rock is different and interesting. And it is constantly the case that she will come home and we'll be doing laundry and her pockets are filled with rocks. And they're, you know, again, mostly the same, sometimes different, but never interesting enough that I would have picked them up. But we're not discouraging her. We talk to her about this passion of hers and this interest and this curiosity that she has. And I want to nurture that instinct, like wherever it goes. And I would hope that, you know, in terms of her education, and I certainly think that this is something that is happening in the institution that she's attending now, that her exposure to history and her experience of getting to know herself and thinking about the differences between herself and other classmates, because that's something that's starting to come up now as well, where she'll sort of talk about the phenotypic differences that she observes between herself and others, that she will always sort of attribute to people the dignity that she would expect to be attributed to her. And that those universalist principles, that basic notion of humanism, will be of foremost importance to her. And that there won't be any aspect of history that she feels either sort of obligated to or tethered to in a way that sort of limits her possibilities or limits her thinking about what she might be able to do. And in much the same way that there isn't any sort of historical traditions that she doesn't feel she can't gain access to if she's interested in them. So again, just nurturing that curiosity and encouraging her to always beat out her own path, and hoping that she's been given enough of the essential tools to be able to do that kind of work for herself, to be thoughtful and critical and skeptical. And I mean those things in all of the best ways possible.
Yeah.
Chloe, do you want to answer for your hypothetical children?
Or mine, you can weigh in on mine too.
don't know. I mean, I think that what both of you said is very compelling and inspirational. I can just speak from the experience of being a 6-year-old that when I was 6 years old, I received the homework assignments to, memorize poetry about Harriet Tubman and by Maya Angelou, and this was very formative in my thinking about my place in the world. And again, this whole idea of the difference between being a slave and the difference between being free. It also imbued me with a sense of wonder about the human condition and my place in it. So that would be the only thing I would add. But the cultivation of a sense of wonder and consciousness and empathy are three things that I think would be important to imbue into any child. So,
Greg?
I mean, yeah. So when you're kids as young as mine is and yours, Matt, a lot of it is sort of in a way the same as you answer when you're thinking about having a kid in prospect, because he's too young to yet be facing any of the kinds of issues that we're talking about here, or to be thinking about them. He's just trying to learn a couple of words. But when I think about what I want for him with respect to what the effect of his education in history and his education in general is with respect to the kinds of issues Black History Month was intended to address, right, is there's just something weird and unhealthy, I think, about the way race is thought about in America. And I don't just mean by one group of people, by white people or Black people or racists or this group or that group. It's just, there's something toxic about the whole conversation where there's something defensive and evasive about it. And everybody seems to have some stake where they get uptight, and it's not like, what happened here? And wow, a lot of this, these people and these art objects and these things are really cool. And there were some bad, I just don't understand it. And I want to. So I'd like the kind of curiosity that everybody talked about to be able to extend in a non-defensive way to just understanding the country and the world he's in and what happened to it. And in a way where that is compatible with, as it should be, and flows naturally with, treating the people he encounters, whatever they may look like, as people. And not thinking, well, I've learned this about the history of slavery, and there's this girl in my class, so she's a former, and you're like, yeah, look at her, she's who she is. So that you can treat people as individuals and relate to them as individuals, and also just be interested in this history and appreciate the art and music you like. I've got a whole music player I've loaded up with my favorite songs for my son, and they're songs I like, and they're in thematic groupings or historical groupings of particular artists. There are a couple of playlists of like blues and Black folk music that he likes and listens to, and I like this music, I like that music. These things are related to each other. They sound alike. I wonder why that is at some point, and just be able to think about it like you'd think about anything else, and not have questions of the history and the moral issues implicated in history overwhelm your ability to think about people that you meet and artworks that you like and other accomplishments as the individual things that they are and with the value they are. So I'm hoping that kind of this generation in general, and my son in particular, to be free of the kind of toxic quality that I think so much of our discourse around race has, and that colors so much of race relations. And
yeah, I mean, that gets at some of the issues that we've kind of indirectly talked around about ways that Black History Month and just racial discourse in education goes wrong, and things that we might want to avoid. I definitely, like, my daughter's even younger, she's 11 months old. And when I think about these issues, they're pretty hypothetical. But I do think that there is the process, like I've seen it happen, like with my college students or with, just with people in my life growing up when I was in high school. Like, you can internalize, I don't know if guilt is the right word, but you can internalize a kind of morality first, reality second kind of perspective when it comes to talking about race. And I think what that does is it kills the things that you guys are all saying that you value. It kills the curiosity and the kind of ability to see particular people and the ability to understand yourself and others in a nuanced way and to be honest. And I worry about that as a negative. I mean, as a positive,
Yeah.
I don't even know how much this relates to, I mean, Black History Month is probably cognitive this, but it doesn't, I don't think it's directly on this topic, but I think a lot about diversity of humanity across kind of multiple spectrums, like race, but also culture, I think is a big one, or personality types is a big one. Like just, I mean, the ability to get value from and offer value to the full range of humanity is, I think, something that potentially starts very young, just in terms of like Sesame Street diversity, like who are you around? Who do you experience? Do you experience Black people and white people and loud people and quiet people and people of different religions and cultures, and this kid in my class doesn't eat meat, and why is that? And just, I mean, there's a huge, I think that there's a value to the kind of more of a range you get, the more intuitive it becomes to precisely be individualistic in your judgments of people's agency and yourself, and to not moralize things and to be attuned to the particular. So I think about that a lot for
I
Alice.
remember when we first dropped our son off at the Nido here, it so happened that all the kids in the room, because they come and go as they age out and new people come in, happened to be, as my son is, basically blonde. And I thought, I don't love that everyone looks the same here. Also, I'm not too good. And now it's got, people just through the luck of who came and went and so forth. Now it's a much more people look very different from different ancestry, from different parts of the world. And I like that to some extent. I think it's nice that your kind of mental schema of what a human being's like and who you can be friends with, not everyone looks the same. But I hope that could happen in a way where he just doesn't notice that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that it's not like,
I mean, my oldest son, my wife is white, I'm Indian, and my oldest son looks Indian, my younger two sons look white. And it's funny seeing how it's playing out. It's so natural. And I think a lot of these things, we impose a certain awkwardness or unnatural element. Like, I mean, his understanding, his 6-year-old understanding of, Martin Luther King Jr. was like, it's at the level of a 6-year-old, and it's fine, and it's going to go deeper, and it's great, and he's like, I think he's like a soldier or something, like he fought against people being mistreated, like he has no idea. And it's like, so like, but there's a way in which you can make it taboo, like, oh wait, no, you can't get that thing wrong the way that you can get everything else wrong. And I just don't want to have that. And so the postscript I would add to what I said is like, I want him to be able to really, and all my kids to be able to really make own whatever heroes they want to make their own. And there's a sense in which, like, someone like Frederick Douglass, and I'm sure Baldwin's like this for you, Matt, like I claim him as my own, like there's plenty of like Black friends I have who I'd be like, yeah, so yes, a very superficial similarity to you, and there's ways in which I've identified in terms of my career and self-education and other things that I think the affinity is much deeper. And so I think there's a sense in which transcending, I see it as an important, race is an important factor to understand, but transcending it, in terms of your own individual sense of who you are and other people is pretty core to my worldview. I don't know what that means for Black History Month. I mean, part of what we're doing here is, we are an intellectual organization that takes our time figuring things out. And so in terms of what does it mean for our schools and our approach, like this is a work over months and years. But I would say, from an advocacy perspective and, starting with educators, like, this is an important topic to think about. That's why we're having this panel. But from the perspective of what role does it play, I think that we're still figuring it out. I'd be curious to hear what others think explicitly about that.
Well, instead of answering that, I'm instead going to ask Chloé a targeted question, and then we can end. Chloé, you have this course that you've created, the Theory of Enchantment, and we've been working with you to kind of create a higher ground integrated version of the course. And it's not irrelevant to some of these questions that we've been talking about. So I just wanted to give you the opportunity to say a little bit about the Theory of Enchantment and in general, but also just how it fits into this discourse of thinking about race and education.
Yeah, so, the Theory of Enchantment is my company. We basically formally train corporations and companies and also individuals who want to enroll in an anti-racism practice that is really rooted in an understanding of the human condition and these values of like resiliency and self-refinement and transcendence. And I think specifically how it relates to this conversation about Black History Month, you know, the first principle of Theory of Enchantment is treat people like human beings, not political abstractions. And part of the question that we're trying to answer is how do you imbue within young people a sensibility of the full, or an understanding of the full range of the human experience or the human condition. And I think part of how you do that through a curriculum on the African American history is by exposing them to people like both Dr. King and Malcolm X, right? And having them wrestle with how these two men, you know, were shaped by their own lived experiences and developed the philosophies that they developed, and not only how they diverged, but why they diverged. And also like building empathy practices within that framework and having students put themselves in the place of both of these individuals and really sort of wrestle with that and have an openness and a sense of curiosity about that. And one of the ways we do this in Theory of Enchantment is by placing, I would say, historical figures like James Baldwin in conversation with contemporary figures like Ta-Nehisi Coates, and actually noting the differences between how these individuals in particular criticized their day and the racial tensions and racial animosity that was occurring in the day, and exposing to young people that there is a difference. There's actually a very deep difference between the two. And so even in that education, you understand that like, it's not like just because two people are Black, they're gonna come to magically to the same conclusions about these issues. So yeah, exposing people to the full range of the human condition is the critical, a critical piece of Theory of Enchantment. It's the critical first principle as applied of Theory of Enchantment. And what that does is it helps people realize that human beings contain multitudes, right? Human beings are complex, and we have the capacity to do good and we have the capacity to do evil, and this exists within every single person. And that, in effect, I think helps give students a sense of groundedness in their own being. And that's how they get that, particularly out of a curriculum that would give them the full range or expose them to the full range of the human condition, specifically in this context of African American history.
Sounds great. How do I register? There'll be a link. There'll be a link embedded in this video or in the video description for how to register. I think that course, the first cohort for that starts at the end of the month, end of February, early March. Yeah, I mean, that's I love the Theory of Enchantment. I think it's an example of like one of many such things that, you know, this is the kind of work that we want to be doing and exploring, and our continual quest to get these issues right in education and to really empower students, really empower individual students, build agency, and like Greg said, kind of create a healthy spirit in the next generation about these issues and a capacity to think about these issues.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming.
One last comment. Yeah, one last comment just to the audience. You know, Camille and Chloe and Greg and Matt and I and others, you know, are meeting quite frequently, doing deep dives into kind of like reading and debating papers, writing papers. It's mostly internal work. This is an interesting exception for us where we've kind of done a more outward-facing panel. So would love to just get feedback of if it's valuable, if you would like to see more of it. We could certainly do more of it. We're you know, focused on getting at the truth and debating and discussing it, but you know, are interested to know, you know, whether there's value in doing that process a little bit more publicly.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks, Camille, Chloe, Greg, so much. Have a great day, guys.
Thank you. Take care.